Empires are built on conquest. We see it on the maps, in the ruins of fallen cities, and in grand monuments to victorious generals. But their greatest conquest, the one that truly secures their power, isn't of foreign lands. It was of their own children. This is the untold story of how boys were systematically broken and reforged, not just by the sword, but by books, brutal training, and relentless psychological pressure. It's a hidden history of how empires conquered the minds of the young to create loyal, unquestioning weapons of the state. These weren't mere soldiers. They were the blade in the hand of empire, forged in silence and obedience. This process, this dark alchemy of turning a child into a tool, isn't an anomaly from one or two cruel regimes. It's a terrifyingly consistent pattern, a blueprint repeated across centuries and continents. To understand the true nature of empire, we have to look past the battlefield and into the classroom, the barracks, and the nursery. We have to examine the systems designed to systematically strip a boy of his identity and replace it with a new one: servant of the state. Today, we're uncovering this hidden history. We'll journey to the unforgiving plains of ancient Greece to witness the notorious Spartan agoge, a machine designed to mass-produce the perfect warrior. Then we'll travel to the heart of the Ottoman Empire to understand the devastating logic of the devshirme, a tax paid not in gold, but in Christian children, who were molded into the Sultan's most loyal and lethal servants, the Janissaries. Looking at these two powerful examples, we can expose the common threads, the secret formula that empires use to secure their most vital resource, the absolute loyalty of the next generation. To understand the Spartan machine, you first have to understand the Spartan terror. The Spartan state wasn't built on a foundation of stone, but on a volcano of human servitude. They were a tiny minority, just a few thousand citizens, ruling over a vast, subjugated population of helots, state-owned serfs who outnumbered them maybe 10 to 1. Every single day, the Spartans lived with the cold, gnawing fear of a massive, bloody uprising. Their entire existence was a balancing act on a knife's edge. Survival, not just conquest, was their primary driver, and their solution was as brutal as it was total. They would turn their state into a military camp, and every male citizen into a perfect warrior from birth until death. The instrument of this transformation was the agoge. The word itself means the upbringing, a deceptively mild term for one of history's most grueling indoctrination systems. The process began at birth. Spartan elders would inspect every male infant. If a child was deemed weak, sickly, or imperfect in any way, he was left on a hillside to die. In the Spartan project, there was simply no room for weakness. For those who passed this first brutal test, the state granted a temporary reprieve. For 7 years, a boy could live with his mother, experiencing the briefest flicker of a normal childhood. But on his 7th birthday, that life ended. He was taken from his family, his home, and everything he'd ever known, and enrolled in the agoge. From that moment on, the state was his father, the state his mother, and the barracks his only home. The first step in forging a Spartan was to erase the individual. Boys were organized into herds, or aegale, living, eating, and sleeping together. Familial affection was replaced by loyalty to the group and absolute obedience to older boys and instructors. This was the rewiring of the human soul. A boy's love for his mother and father was systematically replaced with a devotion to Sparta itself. The training was a masterclass in hardening the body and mind. The boys were given only one cloak to wear for the entire year, forcing them to adapt to blistering heat and freezing cold. They walked barefoot everywhere, their feet becoming tough and calloused. Sleep wasn't a comfort, but another test. They made their own beds by ripping reeds from the riverbanks with their bare hands. Food was a weapon. Rations were kept intentionally meager, to the point of near starvation. This had a dual purpose. It conditioned them to fight through hunger on a campaign, but it also actively encouraged them to steal. Thieving was a critical part of the curriculum, teaching cunning and stealth. But there was a uniquely Spartan catch. The crime wasn't in stealing, but in getting caught. A boy discovered taking food wasn't punished for the theft, but for his incompetence. He would be whipped, sometimes viciously, as a lesson in how to do it better. This twisted logic was designed to produce a specific kind of soldier, one who could break rules to survive, but who lived in mortal fear of failure. This culture of calculated cruelty was everywhere. Fights between boys were encouraged, fostering constant aggression and a pecking order based on pure strength. Ritual beatings were common, not always as punishment, but as a test of endurance. At the festival of Artemis Orthia, boys were forced to run a gauntlet of whips to snatch cheeses from an altar, a bloody spectacle designed to showcase their courage. Many were permanently scarred, some didn't survive. They were taught to read and write, but only as much as was necessary. The real lessons were in obedience and laconic speech, the art of saying the most with the fewest words. A Spartan warrior was to be silent, observant, and brutally efficient, in his words as well as his actions. As the boys reached their late teens, the most promising and ruthless were selected for the Krypteia, the secret service. This was the final, terrifying exam of the agoge. These young men were sent into the countryside with just a knife, told to live off the land and to hunt and kill any helots they found roaming at night. The Krypteia was both a state-sanctioned terror campaign to keep the helot population down and the ultimate test of a young Spartan's loyalty. The state was asking its young men to become murderers in its service, to prove they had shed every last scrap of individual morality for absolute, brutal obedience. From age 20 to 30, the young man was a full-time soldier, living in the barracks even if he married. Only at age 30, after surviving this 23-year ordeal, was he granted the rights of a full citizen. He had been inspected at birth, torn from his home at 7, starved, beaten, and trained to kill. His body and mind were no longer his own. They were the property of Sparta, perfectly forged instruments of war designed for one purpose, the preservation of the state at any human cost. But the Spartans weren't the only ones to turn children into instruments of empire. Centuries later and thousands of miles away, the Ottomans would perfect a similar system on an even grander scale. They wouldn't just create loyal soldiers, they'd create loyal slaves who could rule an empire, all drawn from the very people they had conquered. In the 15th century, the Ottoman Sultan faced a dangerous paradox. His vast empire was built on the strength of Turkish noble families, but these same families had their own ambitions, armies, and loyalties. They were a constant threat, a web of intrigue that could challenge the Sultan's absolute authority. The Sultan needed a new power base, a core of soldiers and administrators with no family ties, no regional loyalties, and no allegiance to anyone but him. His solution was as ingenious as it was cruel. The devshirme. The word translates to the collecting or the levy. It was more commonly known by its other name, the blood tax. Unlike the Spartans, who indoctrinated their own sons, the Ottomans institutionalized a system of human tribute, harvesting boys from the Christian peasant families of their Balkan territories. Periodically, Ottoman officials would sweep through villages in places like Albania, Greece, and Serbia and inspect the local boys. They were looking for strength, intelligence, and good looks. The strongest and brightest, typically between 8 and 18 years old, were taken. For every 40 households, one boy might be selected. He couldn't be an only son, a small, cold mercy in a devastating process. Imagine the scene. A foreign official arrives in your village, lines up the children, and points a finger. That child is now gone, taken from his parents, his culture, and his faith forever. These boys were now, in the eyes of the state, the Sultan's slaves, his kular. Their former lives were over. A new one was about to be forcibly imprinted on them. Upon arriving in the imperial capital, the process of erasing their past began. The boys were forced to convert to Islam, given new Turkish names, and were circumcised. Their native languages were forbidden. This wasn't just a religious conversion, it was a total cultural demolition, designed to sever every root connecting them to their origins. The state was methodically destroying one identity to build another. From here, the boys were sorted. Most were sent to work on farms in Anatolia, living with Turkish families. There, they would learn the Turkish language, the customs of their new world, and endure years of hard labor. This was a deliberate part of their conditioning, designed to toughen their bodies and embed them in their new society. The most intelligent and promising boys, however, were sent to elite palace schools like the Enderun, where they'd receive the finest education in the Islamic world. They studied theology, law, literature, calligraphy, math, and strategy. They learned multiple languages, including Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. This was the dual genius of the Devshirme system. It didn't just produce soldiers, it produced the empire's future leaders. A shepherd's son from a Balkan village, if he was brilliant enough, could rise to become a provincial governor or even the Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the empire. Those destined for the military after their time on the farms would enter the ranks of the Asemi-Oglan, or recruit boys, before finally graduating into the legendary Janissary Corps. Their training was relentless, focusing on archery, horsemanship, and most importantly, firearms, making them one of the first modern gunpowder-based standing armies in Europe. But what truly made the Janissaries unique was the complex nature of their loyalty. A Janissary's loyalty was personal and transactional. They were slaves, yes, but they were the Sultan's slaves, a position of immense privilege. They were paid regular salaries, given the best equipment, and held a high social status. At least initially, they were forbidden from marrying or engaging in trade, a rule designed to keep their focus entirely on the state. Their barracks became their home, their regiment their family, and the Sultan their only father. The system took everything from these boys, their families, their faith, their names, but in return, it offered a path to power and wealth unimaginable in their home villages. It was a brutal bargain, but an effective one. By stripping them of all other allegiances, the Devshirme created a class of men whose entire existence was tied directly to the Sultan. For a time, they were the perfect tool, utterly dependent, fiercely loyal, and lethally effective. The Spartans in their sun-scorched valleys and the Ottomans across their sprawling empire, separated by nearly 2,000 years, seem worlds apart. One, a xenophobic society turning its own sons into state property. The other, a multi-ethnic empire harvesting the sons of its subjects. And yet, if you look beneath the surface, you find they were both working from the same dark blueprint. They had both uncovered the fundamental principles for forging a human being into an instrument of power. The first and most critical principle is isolation and identity erasure. You can't serve a new master while you still love your old one. The cord to the family has to be severed, cleanly and completely. For the Spartan boy, this happened at age 7, when he was physically removed from his parents. For the Christian boy of the Devshirme, the separation was even more absolute, a one-way journey to a foreign land where his language, faith, and even his name were stripped from him. In both cases, the state intentionally created a void where familial love and identity used to be. And into that void, the state pours itself. The state becomes the new father, the ruler, the new patriarch. The second principle is the creation of a new collective identity. Once the old family is gone, a new one must be built. This is done through shared hardship. The Spartan boys in their agila and the Janissaries in their regiments were bonded not by blood, but by struggle. They slept in the same cold barracks, ate the same meager rations, and endured the same punishments. This shared experience forges a bond more powerful than friendship. It creates a brotherhood, an in-group where the collective is everything and the individual is nothing. Your loyalty is no longer to your mother or father, but to the man standing next to you in the shield wall. The third principle is hardship as a forging tool. In these systems, pain, hunger, and fear aren't bugs, they're features. They are the hammer and anvil used to shape the human spirit. The Spartan boy forced to go barefoot in winter and steal his supper learns resilience. The Janissary recruit toiling on a farm for years learns endurance. This constant stress weeds out the weak and builds an extraordinary tolerance for the deprivations of a military campaign. But most importantly, it enforces obedience. A boy conditioned to endure beatings without flinching is a boy who won't question an order on the battlefield. Hardship becomes the price of admission to the elite. And this all leads to the fourth and final principle: total loyalty as the ultimate goal. Every element of the system, the isolation, the new brotherhood, the constant hardship, is designed to produce one thing: an individual whose will is completely swallowed by the will of the state. This four-part formula wasn't unique to Sparta and the Ottomans. We see echoes of it all over history. In the British Empire, adventure novels by authors like G.A. Henty filled boys' heads with stories of upholding imperial honor in distant lands, a form of cultural indoctrination. In Napoleonic France, the Marie-Louise were teenage boys conscripted to fill the army's desperate need for manpower. In Tsarist Russia, the Cantonist system forcibly conscripted Jewish boys, some as young as 8, into military schools for 25-year terms of service, a cruel attempt to erase their identity and ensure their loyalty to the Tsar. There's a fatal flaw baked into this imperial formula. When you create a weapon, you have to be able to control it. When you forge a group of men to be harder and more powerful than anyone else, you create an entity that can, one day, turn on its master. In Sparta, the agoge was a victim of its own terrifying success. It was so effective at producing perfect soldiers that it discouraged everything else, leading to a slow-motion demographic catastrophe. This phenomenon, which Aristotle called oliganthropia, was a crippling shortage of full citizens. The number of Spartan equals dwindled from around 8,000 in the early 5th century BC to less than 1,000 by the mid-4th century. The reasons were baked into the system. The agoge had a high mortality rate, constant warfare meant devastating losses, and strict land ownership rules meant families could lose their citizen status. The system was too rigid to adapt. When Sparta was crushed at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, losing 400 of its remaining citizens in a single day, it didn't have the manpower to recover. The system designed to ensure Sparta's survival had hollowed it out from the inside. The Ottoman story is even more dramatic. The Janissaries, created to be the Sultan's loyal slaves, evolved into the empire's shadow government. Their military monopoly and strong collective identity made them the ultimate kingmakers. They weren't just the Sultan's protectors anymore, they were his jailers. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Janissaries were a deeply entrenched political force. They resisted any attempts at military modernization that might threaten their power. If a sultan tried to curb their influence, they would revolt. Their signal was simple and terrifying. They would overturn their massive soup kettles in the barracks courtyard, a declaration of rebellion that often ended with the deposition and sometimes the murder of the Sultan himself. They had become a parasite holding the empire hostage. This came to a bloody climax in 1826. Sultan Mahmud II, a determined reformer, had secretly built a new modern army. When he announced its formation, the Janissaries, as expected, revolted. But this time, the Sultan was ready. He unfurled the sacred banner of the Prophet and called on the people of Istanbul to rally against the rebels. The event became known as the Vaka-i-Hayri, the auspicious incident. The barracks were set ablaze, and the Janissaries inside were annihilated. For days, the streets ran with blood as the Sultan's forces hunted down and executed any who remained. The centuries-old core was violently and permanently erased. The empire had to unleash horrific violence upon its own creation just to survive. It was the final bloody lesson. When you forge a sword for your enemies, You must always be prepared for the day it is turned against your own throat. What does this tell you about the nature of power and loyalty? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.